Welcome to lecture number 2. Today we will deal with building a vocabulary for social research. There are a number of concepts and terms that are very important for us to understand, so they can be used as we progress in our learning of social research, how to conduct it, and how to plan a research proposal. Okay, so let's start with the first term, a variable. What is a variable? As a matter of fact, when we build a social research project that is aimed at investigating some aspects of the social reality, what we are doing, in fact, is to connect, to associate across variables which come to represent those aspects of society that we are interested in. More strictly speaking, a variable is anything that can be attributed to quantity or a certain quality that changes. So this means that variable can be counted or measured. Classical and very basic examples are age, income, country of birth, class grade. All these items, things, or aspects of social reality are variables in the sense that they are not constant. They can get different quantities or qualities. Now, the most basic distinctions between variables is between independent variables and dependent variables. Basically, independent variables are deemed to have a certain causal influence or effect on dependent variables. Let's expand about this a bit more. Let's take an example to begin with. So, for instance, in the study of cigarette smoking and lung cancer, cigarette smoking will be the independent variable, and health of the smoking person will be the dependent variable. Again, the independent variable is deemed to have an effect or a cause on the dependent variable. That is, cigarette smoking in this case is the what will have an effect, a changing effect on the health, the dependent variable of the smoker. Basically, in every research question, you will be able to identify the relation that is claimed in the project between an independent variable and a dependent variable. And the aim of the research project will be generally to prove or disprove that relation between what is at the beginning in our hypothesis deemed to an A variable to have an effect on a B variable. Again, the independent variable having effects on dependent variables. Let's look into two more examples. After World War II, one of the most famous collective research, trying to understand the sort of society that emerged towards World War II in Germany, Italy, Spain, authoritarian and dictatorial societies and regimes. So one important research trying to understand those phenomena and the kind of effect that these regimes had on people was Theodor Adorno's collective research on the authoritarian personality. This research was about trying to understand the influence of certain aspects of social life on creating what this team of researchers define as authoritarian personality. So they investigated family background, personal experience of people, levels of education, the class to which people belong, and other aspects of people's life, and they blend all this together to try to form an understanding of how a personality of people can unfold into what they understood as being authoritarian. So in this case, the authoritarian personality is the dependent variable, that variable that is affected by a series of other factors. In this case, all those social aspects of people's life that I mentioned before. Another example is democratic schooling. We are mostly aware of traditional schooling, but in all over the world, there are schools that are built as democracies in the sense that students and staff can together participate in decision making in the school. The idea behind democratic schooling is that it has different effects on the formation of democratic attitudes, allegedly more positive effects. There are many studies that have investigated democratic schooling, and most of them agree that indeed there are benefits in the sense of forming more progressive and positive democratic attitudes in students and staff in those democratic frameworks at the level of school, both primary and high school. Now, in this case, democratic schooling, the framework will be the independent variable, and democratic attitudes will be the dependent variable. If we change the framework to a traditional schooling, and we want to check also democratic attitudes, again we will have that the traditional schooling is the independent variable and democratic attitudes will be the dependent variable. It's very common in this kind of research to have comparative research between different schooling frameworks, traditional versus democratic, so as to compare the depth of democratic attitudes developed in the two different frameworks. I said before that generally in research questions, what we should be identifying is these two variables, the dependent and independent variable, and to also identify the relation between them that the project is asking to study. In these three examples, it is relatively easy to do this work of identification. Let's start with the first. What effect does daily use of Twitter have on the attention span of under 16s? So as you can see, daily use of Twitter is the independent variable, while attention span, the variable that daily use of Twitter has an effect or an alleged effect on, is the dependent variable. In the second question, how do the US and the UK compare in health outcomes and patient satisfaction among low-income people with chronic illnesses? Here, the independent variable is low-income people with chronic illnesses, and the dependent variable is health outcomes and patient satisfaction. While in fact, what this research question is asking to study is the US and UK policies on health for people with chronic illnesses, and also to do a comparison. In the third question, how have economic, political, and social factors affected patterns of homelessness in Sydney over the past 10 years? So again, the independent question will be the economic, political, and social factors, and this is a bit too broad, and I believe that this question to be more researchable should be narrowed down in terms of which kind of economic, political, and social factors we are referring to. In this question, these factors are working as the causes of homelessness, in this case in Sydney, and the research is being limited to the past 10 years. So in these three questions, you can see how independent and dependent variables are playing out and establishing a relation, an association that need to be studied, which stand at the heart of the research questions. We move forward to our next term, ontology. From Greek, ontology means the study of beings. For us, this is about understanding the nature of social entities, the very things that make up social life, such as the institutions and social frameworks we live in, labor, our identities, families, friendship, and so forth. One central question in regards ontology of social beings is whether social entities, those things that I just mentioned, should be considered objective realities, things that are given to us, that are external to us as social actors, or perhaps they should be considered as things that we social actors are involved in constructing them, in shaping them. In this regard, we distinguish between objectivist ontology and social constructivist ontology. Let's have a look at both. In objectivist ontology, or researchers that believe that this is the way we should refer to the nature of social beings, social phenomena are seen as external to people, external to social actors, to agency. They have an existence of their own, they form our reality that is seen as objectively given. We as individuals and groups are born into these pre-existing settings. We come to obey and conform with the rules, laws, and norms that this objective reality has for us. And also, culture exists independently of social actors. Culture, society are those processes and phenomena through which we become socialized, through which we acquire the values, beliefs, and behaviors that we generally have in our particular society. So that's objectivist ontology, an ontology that sees our reality, the reality that it is around us and we are part of, as something that is given. On the other hand, there is another way to understand the ontology of social beings, I mean the nature of social beings, as being socially constructed. This means that in this approach, social phenomena and the interpretation of social phenomena, the meaning of social phenomena, are all shaped by the intervention of social actors, of individuals and groups. Also, the way we understand events are social constructions, which means that in fact there cannot be only one account of an event, an understanding or interpretation of an event, but in fact there can be many alternative interpretations, all of them shaped by people and groups. You may ask yourself why it is important to understand ontology in regards our approach to social research. Well, if I am an objectivist ontologist, my approach to social research in regards the kind of questions I will be asking about social entities, social frameworks, institutions, identities, and so on, will be conservative in the sense that I will probably aim mainly to understand how these frameworks work. On the other hand, if I am a social constructivist ontologist, my questions will be probably be more progressive in the sense that I will also inquire about how these frameworks can be changed. I will not probably refer to these social frameworks, the social entities, like again, institutions, identities, and so on, as something that is given an end of story. But since I understand social institutions as things that are constructed, shaped by people, by individuals and groups, I will assume probably that these institutions have changed over time and can be changed also in the present and in the future. So I will regard the agency of people as important and significant in the way social entities are shaped and reshaped. This is quite a distinction between these two ontological types of approaches to social research. How knowledge is born, how we do produce knowledge. Let us distinguish here between two philosophical approaches to this question: empiricism and rationalism. In the Anglo-American tradition, empiricism is about producing knowledge based only on sensory experience through observation. We have the senses that enable us to observe, to measure phenomena, and to produce information and knowledge. But on the other hand, rationalism holds that knowledge is produced because of the faculty of reason that people have. Reason is assumed to be a unique feature or faculty of the mind through which the truth we know and we can know about reality can be grasped independently of the senses. In other words, what rationalists are saying is that people have certain structures in their mind that enable them to produce knowledge, prior or regardless to experience, while empiricists will deny that possibility. So this is a kind of contention that puts the faculty of reason against the senses and how they enable us to produce knowledge. Empiricism versus rationalism. Let's have a look at this picture of two straws in a glass of water. The straws submerged in water look bent, though we know that they are not. A similar issue happens with railroads tracks that when you look at them, they seem in the distance to converge, but we know that they are not. Otherwise, trains would not be able to ride on them. Now, anyone who believes really that the straws are really bent and that the railroad tracks converge is mistaken. This is not how the world really is. But the question then is how we know that this is really how the world really is. Which kind of epistemological approach we can use to gather the knowledge about what is really happening. So we may use the senses and measure things up, or we can use reason, for instance, using our knowledge of the laws of optics and knowing that in fact we see the straws bent because of refraction of light in the water, and then we can know the facts. So these two examples show how we can arrive at the right picture of reality using two approaches, either empiricism or rationalism. What happens in reality with these cases is that we generally use both. We already have some knowledge of the physical laws or other kind of law that govern reality, and we also use empiricism to measure up how things are working. So as said, empiricism and rationalism are two different epistemological approaches. By epistemology, we mean simply to theories of knowledge, or in other words, how we know what we know. How can we extract knowledge of some aspect of the social reality? So let's pause for a moment and see which terms and concepts we have presented so far. So we talked about variables, independent and dependent variables, and how they work in a research question and in a research project. We talked about ontology and the two different approaches to the nature of social entities and things in social life, objectivism and social constructivism. And we also talked about two different epistemological approaches. Empiricism, which is based on the senses and the aspiration to try and measure up everything, and rationalism, which assumes that the mind is able in itself to apprehend social reality. We now move to present two different approaches to investigation, deduction and induction. That is, given a particular subject, we can choose to go through two different ways in the sense of how we want to approach the investigation itself. The deductive approach starts from what we know, given theories about social life, and then given a particular question of interest that we want to investigate, we try to present, to deduce a hypothesis that will be tested in the research itself. That is, whatever we are claiming in that hypothesis will be subjected to empirical scrutiny. Let's return, for instance, to the example we discussed before about democratic education. So this is how deductive approach will be used to study this topic. We start with theories about education, with theories about democracy. These will be the theories in the area of our research. Perhaps we should be using also some theories about cognitive psychology that is related to how we acquire knowledge. Then we present a hypothesis. Democratic education induces democratic beliefs. This is the hypothesis we need to test, we need to study. We need either to embrace or reject. We will go then to collect data in an empirical way by measuring up, for instance, comparing between democratic school and traditional school. We can compare how these two types of frameworks are run, governed, and how students and staff in these frameworks develop attachment to democratic attitudes and beliefs. Eventually, we will arrive to a conclusion which will confirm or reject the hypothesis. This is how the deductive approach can be used, how it works, starting with a dimension of theories that we have, deducing an hypothesis, the study itself, and then we arrive at our conclusion, which confirms or rejects the initial hypothesis. But if the hypothesis is confirmed, perhaps there should be room to go back to our initial theories or theory, revise them, and correct them. So, in our deductive approach to research, generally there will be one more step, depending on our conclusion, that is about going back to the theory once we have findings and revising it. This last stage here in the graph named as sixth, we will call it the inductive stage of the research. So let's go now and understand what is the inductive approach. The inductive approach starts from findings of specific cases that we study, and then based on our findings and understandings, we derive a theory or a statement about the topic we are investigating. In other words, induction draws inferences from observation in order to create new theory. Now, as you can see, this works the other way around as deduction. And this is why I mentioned that the last stage in the previous slide in the deductive approach is in fact about induction, because it was about refining, revising, correcting the original theory. So in induction, we start by doing the empirical research, collecting the evidence, classifying facts, identifying new patterns that we believe are a regularity of social behavior or something that regularly characterize social life. And eventually, we infer a statement or a theory that represent the truth about that topic that we were investigating. Now, also here, we can see that the last stage in this process can be seen as deduction. Again, in the last slide, we saw as induction steps into a deductive process as a last stage of research, and we have the same thing here but the other way around, because here the last stage is about confirming that the theory that we have now developed in fact can be tested with further observation in new cases. This graph shows how theory and the empirical process of collecting data and then analyzing and inferring are connected from a deductive point of view and then an inductive point of view. So as you see, these work in opposite direction. Deductive approach starts with a theory, as we said, and eventually we will go on to testing that theory to see if eventually we need to correct the theory. Whereas the inductive approach will start with a case and making the findings into a new theory, though again, this new theory could be tested further to see how it works. In other words, every good research project will generally have both deductive components and inductive components. A very important question is whether or not the social world can be studied according to the same principles, procedures, and ethos as the natural sciences. There are two answers to this question. One is positivism and the other interpretivism. The positivist position claims that we can study the social world as if we were dealing with the natural world, whereas interpretivism claims that given that the subject matter of the social sciences, that is, people, institutions, social life, is fundamentally different from that of the natural world, we should create a different logic of research, different set of tools, and different methodologies. Let's have a closer look at the principles of positivism. Positivism relies on empiricism, which means that in this position, knowledge can be produced only by the senses. Apart from that, positivism embraces both ways for investigation, deduction and induction, and there are two other principles that are very important to mention. One of them is that research can and should be objective. This means that research, also in the social sciences, can and should be value-free. We will contest this position later. And the last one is that there should be a clear distinction based in the previous principle. There should be a clear distinction between scientific and normative statements. And what really belongs to social science is scientific statements. So positivism claims that the normative should be kept outside social research. Let us now compare between positivism and interpretivism along axes that relate to actual social research. First of all, in regards to the relationship between society and the individual. In positivism, society shapes the individual, so there are social facts out there, whereas in interpretivism, individuals have consciousness and react to social forces. Now, if you remember, these two positions reflect the two positions in ontology: objectivism versus social constructivism. The second dimension of the focus of social research: in positivism, the whole point of research is about to uncover the laws or regularities that govern human behavior, whereas in interpretivism, the whole point of research is to understand and interpret the lives of groups and individuals. The focus is on how people live, how institutions unfold, whereas back to positivism, the focus is to discover or uncover the social laws that govern life without challenging with interpretation that social world. In regards research methods, positivism will prefer quantitative methods. We will talk about this a bit later. Whereas interpretivism will prefer qualitative methods. So as you can see, these are quite two different positions, though in certain research projects, depending on the profile of the researcher and the topic, we may find some mixed positions that bring together some of the principles of positivism and some of the principles of interpretivism, though we can still identify quite a hard distinction as far as it relates to the ontological position of both approaches, the epistemological positions of both approaches, and also in regards the how to do social research. One common confusion when people start studying about research, and particularly social research, is between the terms methodology and methods. Methodology is a system. It's a system that brings together the different orientations to how we study a topic. Basically, whether we recognize that or not, every methodology encapsulates two dimensions. One is more technical and the other political. By the technical dimension, we mean what generally is defined as quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methodologies or strategy. I will talk about this briefly in the next slides. By political dimension, we mean where the research is orienting itself in regards the topic of study. Does the research prefers to understand the regularities of the social facts and institutions that is studying without challenging its formation, its history, and its future? Or perhaps the research is much more active in its intentions, its political intentions, and for instance, adopts a feminist approach, an indigenous approach, or more militant activist strategies to research that topic. In these last cases, the research will be trying not just to studying a phenomenon, but also to challenge it with a view to change the course of things in social life. Now, all these approaches are political, or also the conservative. The conservative approach is political in the sense that it is asking to maintain the state of things. That's indeed very political. Whereas the other approaches are aiming at studying a topic with a view to change the social facts, the social life that it is investigating. That's for methodology. Method is just the tools and the technique that we use to mine, to gather, to collect the data in our research project. Let's have a look at some differences between quantitative and qualitative research strategies. Quantitative research can be construed as a research strategy that emphasizes quantification in the collection and analysis of data, and that entails a deductive approach to the relationship between theory and research, in which the emphasis is placed on testing theories. It incorporates the practices and norms of the natural scientific model and of positivism, and in particular embodies a view of social reality as an external objective reality, which is that ontological orientation we call objectivism. By contrast, qualitative research can be construed as a research strategy that usually emphasizes words rather than quantification in the collection of and analysis of data, and predominantly emphasizes an inductive approach to the relationship between theory and research, in which the emphasis is placed on the generation of theory. Qualitative research rejects the practices and norms of the natural scientific model and of positivism, in particular in preference for an emphasis on the ways in which individuals interpret their social world. And it also embodies a view of social reality as a constantly shifting emergent property of individuals' creation. Now, while it is useful to contrast these two research strategies, the distinctions are not a hard one. Studies that have the broad characteristics of one research strategy may have a characteristic of the other. This means that the two can be combined within an overall research project that we generally will call as adopting a mixed method research strategy. In fact, I would say that many of the research projects in social science, those with high significance, they do mix these two strategies and the methods that these two strategies entail. So we have here all the different aspects that we have been discussing in regard the influences or the factors that we need to take into account when we start designing a research project. Now, we have the dimension of theory, how we relate to theory in the sense of adopting a more deductive or more inductive approach, though we saw that both are related and can be amalgamated in one research project. There are always practical considerations in terms of the funding of the research that need to be achieved, ethical considerations, also consideration of time. How long will be the research? Do we have the team to conduct it? Do I have the proper research skills? There are considerations of epistemology, as we saw. We may be adopting a more positivist or perhaps interpretivist approach to the research. There are considerations of ontology, whether we are on the social constructivist or objectivist pole of things. And also, we acknowledge that all social research has values, has a political orientation, whether a more conservative or a more militant, that takes into consideration social problems with a view to change them. In the coming weeks, we are going to discuss this point extensively, but for now, just a word on methods and techniques. So, broadly speaking, there are two families of those, the qualitative versus the quantitative. While qualitative methods are based on the analysis of words, quantitative methods are based on the analysis of numbers. And here you have a list of different techniques that researchers use, such as interviews, focus group, observation in ethnography, sampling, document analysis, and more. Whereas in the quantitative set, we will generally find surveys, opinion polls, structure observation. We can also add here a structure interview, content analysis, and so forth. As said, we will be discussing all these techniques in the coming weeks. So let us now, to end this lecture, sum up the vocabulary that we have built today. In our first attempt to build a vocabulary for social research, we discussed the significance of variable and distinguish between independent and dependent variables and how they sit in a research question. We talk about ontological positions and distinguish between objectivism and social constructivism. We also distinguish between empiricism and rationalism as epistemological positions. We discuss the two approaches to investigation in relation to how theory and collecting data sits once after the other, from deduction to induction and the other way around. We also discuss positivism and interpretivism as the two main paradigms in social research, and then we distinguish between methodology and methods, taking into account that methodology has mainly two dimensions, one that is more technical, pointing to quantitative and qualitative sets, and the other more political, which takes into account that our social life is embedded in values, and research does indeed take this into account, whether we recognize it or not. Well, this is all for today's lecture.